الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأصلي وأسلم على سيد الأولين والآخرين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. All praise are due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad, the master of the first and the last, his family, his companions, and all those who call to his way to the day of judgment. As to what follows, my beloved brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, it is again an opportunity to travel beyond the sands to the west. Not the west in a Western sense, but the west in a Mecca-centric sense. What do I mean by that? I mean that this study is following the movement of history from Mecca to the west, to the north, to the east, to the south, and in particular, in this series, to the west. And so the near west of Mecca, we learned, was Ethiopia, was East Africa. The west itself, the name the west was given to Al-Maghrib, and that is Morocco. North Africa was Al-Maghrib, because the Islamic historians thought in the same way. They did not think that the center of the world was in Europe, but they centered themselves in the revelation, in the heartlands of Islam, and then looked at the rest of the world. So we have been moving along to the west, passing through North Africa, into Al-Andalus, down into West Africa, and in our last session we journeyed to the far west, and that is across the Atlantic. And we found out, according to our own sources, that there were Muslims in the Americas before Columbus. And this has been documented, and even though there are many historians, even Muslims, who are afraid to touch this topic because it ruffles the feathers of the Eurocentric Orientalists, there is as much proof to show Muslims before Columbus than there is to show Leif Erikson of the Vikings in Canada. And so what happened before Columbus's time? Because the journey was not just before Columbus. What happened after his time? And we want to now step back a little bit, because we were actually, going before Columbus to the Americas, to the different societies. But now we want to go back a little further in Al-Andalus, tie it together, and then see what happened in Columbus's time and then after his time. And so we recognized that the struggle that was happening in Al-Andalus, Spain, and Portugal was not just what they call reconquista or a reconquest. No, because the Trinitarians were not the original people in Al-Andalus, in the Iberian Peninsula. There were people who believed in one God. What happened after the period of time Muslims were flourishing in Al-Andalus was what we term as Crusades. Now, normally when we think of the Crusades, we think of the European forces going east. That was after Pope Urban II in the 11th century then, encouraged them, commanded them to go to the east and take the riches and take the society. But that wasn't the only crusade. There was also a crusade to the west. And the Pope and the people in authority in Christendom wanted to not only defeat the Muslims in Syria and Palestine and Turkey, but they also wanted to defeat the Muslims in Al-Andalus. And in order to do that, you have to go west. And on the western side, what they saw was a thriving society. They saw Cordoba that had reached the heights by the year 1000 AD. It was one of the largest cities in the world. Much of the great progress that was made by Europe intellectually and even physically came out of Al-Andalus. And so there were a lot of skills and riches that they could obtain. And so when they began to conquer, and we looked in previous sessions at some of the actual conquests itself, but when they conquered the areas coming from the north and then going down, and this of course was facilitated mainly by Muslims who turned against each other. So that disunity, leaving the Sunnah, that greed for material wealth enabled these forces to start to take territories. When they would conquer an area in northern Spain, they needed the Muslims. So it was not wholesale extermination or displacement, because you would be displacing the people with the skills, the people with the civilization. So they did not displace the people. They maintained them. And they would make the people wear special type of clothing, and even sometimes they made them wear badges so they could be immediately identified as Muslims. And the general term that they used for the Muslims was moros. And moros in Latin means a person of color, a dark-skinned person. And that is what we have come to know. In English, we say the Moors. And even Shakespeare wrote about Othello, the Moor. And so that was a general terminology. Amongst the people then, specific people who became their servants, mudahares was the term, meaning a domesticated impostor, somebody who was subjugated, a Muslim servant. So it's mudahares, or mudajjan, we would say. So what happened then in these areas is that the majority of the people are still Muslims or related to Muslims. And the Trinitarians wanted complete control, not just physical control. They wanted mental, spiritual, psychological control. And so they began what is known as the Inquisition. And this happened in different phases, but maybe the biggest phase was around 1483. You really see the Inquisition coming into its fruition. The Inquisition, which was sanctioned by Rome itself, by the Pope, it was a way of going from Muslim servants or Jewish servants to people who were actually within Christianity, because they didn't want to tolerate it anymore. And so what they would do is that they would send in an inquisitor. And this is a specially trained person with his assistants who were trained in types of torture. And they would literally bring people in one by one or group by group, and they would test them to see whether they're still Muslims or still Jews or still Christians who believed in one God. Because they knew that many of the Muslims were escaping. So they wanted in their territory to have total control over the people. And you can see in these pictures that I've brought, these are actually artist conception of what happens in the Inquisition. So many of the modern day torture techniques that are being used on people, we saw it in Guantanamo Bay, we see it in Palestine, you'll see it in many places where the colonial powers, many of these techniques began here in the Inquisition. And so their first process was baptize. So they wanted to baptize the Muslim or the Jew or the person who believed in one God to believe in Father, Son, Holy Ghost, right, the Trinity. And they would test them, and they would offer them, they could come into Christianity or die. And so it reached that, terrible point. And many people refused, and those who refused, openly refused, in many cases they were burnt at the stake. And this is a terrible way to die because of the pain of the fire, starting from your feet and then moving up. So of course there are many people who were not able to resist. And those Muslims who could not resist the pain, they did not want to go through this suffering, and they said, okay, we'll submit, we'll baptize. So a baptized Muslim was called Morescos. Remember these names, because you're going to see these names popping up even in America today, in Central America, and you'll see these names popping up. So this was a baptized Muslim or a Christian Moor. The Jewish people who refused, who decided to submit, so you're on the outside Catholic, inside Jewish, they are called Morenos or Conversos. And you'll even see there's politicians in Central America, in Mexico, their even name is Moreno. There's a Moreno party actually in Central America right now. And see, if you don't know these names, you wouldn't know that this is a Jewish party actually. Their origins are Jewish, but they claim on the outside to be Christian. And so this was a type of slow genocide. When the fighting could not defeat the people, then torture, brainwashing, subjugation was used in these northern countries, and it started to move down toward the south. And surprisingly enough, they went to extremes. And it is said that even there were people who qualified for burning at the stake if they were unrepentant heretics. Okay, so if you're a heretic and you're unrepentant, that's clear, but also relapsed heretics. So if you were Muslim, or if you were Jewish and you start showing some Islamic traits, you start doing certain things that Muslims do, like you don't eat pork or you don't, anything like that, then you could be burnt at the stake. And I remember that it was in Granada, and we were traveling along and we entered into a house, in the Muslim section of town. And because of the Inquisition and many of the Muslim houses, as you enter the house, just to the left on the wall is a stand with a Quran was on this stand. Okay, but just as you enter the house, you see a stand, high. Okay, it's like a shelf. So why is that? And it was told to us that if the Muslims were, making prayer or whatever they were doing, something suspicious, and there was a knock on the door, then they could run to the door, open it up, and their Bible, actually it's a Bible, their Bible was right there, and then they could, have the Bible, they could read it. So there's all types of tricks that they had to use in order to maintain their faith. And in some cases, they burnt, there's some records to say that in the years up to 1490, that over 2,000 people were burnt alive. Okay? The Islamic response to this naturally is resistance. And that is the word jihad, which does not mean holy war, by the way. And you'll never find it in the Quran or in the sayings of the Prophet where jihad equals holy war. Because there is no concept like this. War is not holy. Okay, jihad is resistance. That you resist personally, family, society, on all different levels. If you could not resist, then the next option was hijrah. And that was migration. So you would then leave, the lands of oppression, and you would head, in most cases, it's south. Okay? So with that, Muslims and Jews were forced to resist or to migrate. And some estimates say that over 2 million Jews were killed or exiled, and over 3 million Muslims. Now, and the numbers of people, these are large numbers, by the way, because in those days, the populations were not as large as you have the populations today. And so people are moving out now. Okay, they're moving out. And it continued until they reached Granada. The conquistadors reached Granada, and in 1492, Abu Abdullah, Boabdil, the last leader of Granada, he surrendered. And so the Muslims were now leaving, the Jews were leaving. And at the same time, it is reported, and I found out actually in Granada, that right after the surrender of Abu Abdullah to the King and Queen of Castile and Aragon, when it was over, Christopher Columbus was by the door, and he came in. And he said to the King and Queen, now you need wealth, and I can get that for you. If you outfit me, go further, there's land, I believe, across the ocean. We have proof of this. And if you support me, I'll bring you back gold. And so the movement of the Spanish, Portuguese, going west, this was not just innocent explorers who just love to travel and they want to see the world. No, this was part of their conquest. This was part of their colonization, because they had dreams of being the champions and the controllers of the world. And you see the Portuguese going out first, and then the Spanish. And the Portuguese were the most natural to go out first, because in terms of their country, half their country is on the ocean, the western side. The eastern side is Spain, and there's treaties with the Spanish rulers that are there. So the only way they could expand is the ocean. And so you find the Portuguese going out first, and then the Spanish who are going out. And so this is part of the conquest. That's how they looked at it. And when they reached the lands there in the west, they acted like conquerors. And that was a shock, of course, to the indigenous people who did not, they were not accustomed to people dealing with them in this way. So the Morescos now, remember the word Moresco, okay? Morescos, if you were found guilty of heresy, right, going against your Catholicism in any way, then not only would they burn you alive, but after a while, they would condemn you to work on the boats, because boats are going out. So they condemn you to be a galley slave, okay? And they would try to find anything. If they investigated a man and found out that this person, although he's a Moresco, that he was circumcised, could happen to the Jew too, then they're going to put you on the boats. And that means you're going to work on those boats for your life. And King Philip II, and these Portuguese too, he ordered the Inquisition to sentence to the galleys without question anyone found guilty of even performing circumcisions. So you could be a Christian and you do circumcision of males, you're going on the boat. So they were looking for a way to get cheap labor, literally for slaves, to be working on these boats in order to conquer the so-called New World. And in the 16th century, the Cardinal Jimenez, the Grand Inquisitor of Spain, right? He was called the missionary to the Moors. Like that's literally, his name. But he complained that Islam was being openly practiced in the Americas, especially by Morescos. So this is Spanish records now, to show that the people who were going out on the boats, and we know Columbus, Balboa, all the different ones who were going out, the people who were on their boats, many of them were Morescos. And it is said that when Columbus sighted land in San Salvador, in the Bahamas, it was actually Rodrigo de Triana, who was a Moresco, who first sighted land, right? And then Columbus took the credit. Okay, but they were part of it, and they had skills. They had navigational skills. They still had the Islamic background that included the usage of the compass and the knowledge of the world. It was something that was still there. And by 1560, okay, when the Spanish had taken Peru in South America, there's a record that showed that they executed Lope de la Peña and his cohorts, Luis Solano. Why? For practicing and spreading Islam. This is their records. Practicing and spreading Islam in Peru, in South America. So there was a lot going on. A lot of resistance was happening, and the Muslims actually had a presence going across with Columbus, and then after the time of Columbus. And on July 31st, 1502, a Spanish ship in the Caribbean reported a strange 40-foot-long Moorish ship with 40 men and women dressed in Moorish cloth. And the women covered their faces. This is in their records. So that's a presence of Muslims actually over there. So there's a lot of things like this, but the Spanish had this rule of any book or any records they found that was not theirs, they'd destroy it. So you couldn't trace it. But still, things are coming out. And by 1566, okay, remember Columbus is 1492, right? That's first contact. But by 1566, the Spanish established St. Helena in South Carolina. And it was captured by the English in 1567. Okay, and the English wrote in their records that its inhabitants, many of whom were Morescos. They called them Morescos. They fled into the mountains, especially the mountains in now North Carolina. Okay, so these are records now of the Morescos being over there, and the Spanish now is, making this colony in America. And these Morescos are fleeing, and they're moving into the mountains. So this is how America actually looked. Okay, and we have our Canada up on the top too. Okay, which in this map, this is an older map, they called it British America because the British thought that they controlled everything. The French had a piece. But if you look at America on the East Coast, you will see in the dark colors, these are the original 13 colonies. And if you look in the middle, there's Illinois territory, there's Mississippi territory. You see, go down to Florida, Spanish Florida. You see, look at the middle of America. This was actually Louisiana. And it was controlled by the French. So it was purchased. Now, interestingly enough, go to California and the Southwest, and you see Spanish Mexico. So all of that territory going up was actually part of Mexico. So when you speak about people, illegal immigrants, and they're kicking Mexican people out, this is their land. They are the indigenous people. Mexican people are First Nations indigenous people. And their territory, and this is right up to the founding of the Americas, and you're going, up into 1800s. This is Mexican territory. This is not America. There's no California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. None of this. So that was the reality at the time. And of course, this is how realities are covered up over. We want to uncover something of the reality for Muslims. And in the 16th century, there was cooperation between the British and the Ottomans. Now remember, the Europeans were fighting each other. There was no European Union, and we're all one nation. That's a lie, even today. But the British were fighting heavy wars against the Spanish. And so at certain points, they were actually had alliance with the Ottomans, who controlled North Africa and parts of the Mediterranean. And so there was actually cooperation. And if you go back to 16th century, 17th century England, they were fascinated by the Ottomans. Fascinated. And a lot of the British culture was based upon what they learned from the Ottomans. And it's shocking that even at that time, British people did not drink coffee and drink tea. Of course, tea is from India, right? So that's where they learned to drink tea, which is so British today in the afternoon to have your tea, right? They didn't drink coffee. Coffee had come from Ethiopia and was in Yemen, taken to Yemen. And when the Ottomans took over Yemen, they organized coffee shops. So you found in Istanbul coffee shops, and these coffee shops became centers of discussion, debate. Intellectuals would go there. And so the idea of a coffee shop went to London, and they opened up a coffee shop. And the intellectuals loved it. And they would drink coffee, this new drink, which would keep them awake. And so this became the culture. Look at today. Look at what coffee means in the West. But how many people realize how coffee actually came into the West? This is an interesting picture for me, because this brother here, Abdul Wahid ibn Mas'ud, look at him today, and they would say, he's a terrorist. Look at his sword. Okay, look at his turban. Look at that mean look on his face. Okay, he was the principal secretary to the Moroccan ruler, Moulay Ahmed al-Mansour, and he was the ambassador to the court of Queen Elizabeth I of England in 1600 to promote the establishment of Anglo-Moroccan alliance. So this is how he appeared in England, in their courts, in their parliament. That's what he looked like. You see? That shows you the cover-up, right? How they can cover up the presence of Muslims in that part of the world. Now, to look at the story further now, in 1586, Sir Francis Drake, a famous British naval commander, with 30 ships, he raided the Portuguese in Brazil. And according to his records, he freed 300 Moorish galley slaves. See the term he's used? Remember Moors, right? Moorish galley slaves. And he took them from Brazil. He was called back to England, and so he let them out so he could go back. And he let them out on the Roanoke Island, which is off the coast of the southeast corner of America. This is in the records, okay? And the Spanish records talk about these galley slaves all the time. Remember Moriscos? Or they would just call them a bunch of Moors. And in the English records, for instance, they would speak of galley slaves. They say it's an assemblage of Turks, Moors, Greeks, Frenchmen, and Negroes. So this is how they describe their galley slaves. But you can see who's in there. Okay? So these are points which are in the records. And if you have the eye to see, you can bring it out of the records. Also, in that early phase in America, there was a Muslim, Estevanico of Azamor, from Morocco. And he was part of an expedition in 1527. Okay, and he stayed in America, actually, and he became the first of these European group, or this non-indigenous group, to actually cross the continent. So he crossed the continent. And this is sort of his journey. You can follow the green line, and he comes in and then goes up to Florida, goes right across, and then he's deep in the area there in Arizona and in Mexico itself. He eventually died in this area, but they still have statues for him. I believe it's in New Mexico. Estevanico. Okay? He's clearly called the Moor. So that is presence, clear presence of Muslims. And there's a number of points that we have, very interesting points. In 1654, the Portuguese, the Americans reported what they call bearded Portuguese silversmiths. Because in America you had Europeans, okay, who were British, French, Germans, whatever, and you had Africans who were enslaved, and then you had indigenous people, First Nation, but then you have another group of people. And so when they found this other group, they just called them Portuguese. And that name stuck with a lot of people on the East Coast. They say Geechees. Geechee is a term which is used in the East Coast of America. Anyhow, the report is saying in 1654 that these Portuguese silversmiths were reported to drop to their knees many times daily to pray. They dropped to their knees. These are American records. In 1784, Tennessee Governor John Sevier, he met with some of these people, okay? And in the early 1700s, Jonathan Smith, an Englishman, married what he called a Mecca Indian. Okay, because these people were not First Nation. They were not indigenous. But they're like something else, right? So he just called them, she's a Mecca Indian. And so from as early as the 18th century, this group, which has been defined by some as they call Melungeons, the Melungeons were of Moorish descent. And Judge Lewis Shepard, who had defended a Melungeon girl in a famous Tennessee case in 1872 regarding interracial marriage, contended that her people were Portuguese Moors. Right, he was defending her. Now, this is a picture of her. And you can see the look that she has. See, this is different now. And so this group of people, and there was a Brent Kennedy did a study, and so this group has been identified as Melungeons. Okay, and people have been trying to understand the root of this term. Some say it comes from Turkish, or people whose life have been cursed, and some even trace it to Arabic, from Arabic through Turkish. And in Arabic they would say Mal'oon Jinn, Mal'oon Jinni, Melungeon. Mal'oon means cursed. And Jinni is the jinn, right? And because they felt that because their life was so difficult, they were suffering so much, they must be under some kind of curse. And this is an actual picture of Melungeon people. And if you look at them, look at their look. Right? So these people are still there today, and they're identified, especially in the Appalachian region of the United States. These Melungeon people are there. In 1990, Dr. James Guthrie, he found blood samples of these people, which were the same as North Africa, Turkey, Iraq, and the Mediterranean region. And N. Brent Kennedy, who did a book on the Melungeons and became famous, he brought it out. He had this disease called sarcoidosis. It's like a nerve-based disease. And when he studied it in terms of DNA and where it comes from, it was identified to be people who came from the Mediterranean and sometimes from Turkey and Iraq and places like this. Okay? So the Melungeons, of course, they were Christianized. They were not able to hold on to their faith. They became Christianized Portuguese Moors. This is how they were known. Okay, and this is another picture of a Melungeon. Okay, so this is how they look. And today, Melungeons can be found all over the United States, although many of the people might not even know what they are. But they are trying to identify themselves now. because they're actually part of America. And and some of them are actually checking out Islam as well, because for the most part, that was their background. Okay, because they're not Afro or black, they're not white, and they're not indigenous people. Okay, so this is the person, Brent Kennedy, and within his study, and this is interesting because I tested this in New York and in Philadelphia with predominantly African-American Muslims, and what he found is that people with the following names in southeast of America could be from this group: Adams, Adkins, Bell, Bennett, Berry, Bowling, Chavis. These are famous names. Coleman, Collins, Gibson, Goins, Hall, Jackson, Lopez, Moore, Mullins, Nash, Robinson, Sexton, and Williams. People in the southeast who have these names could be connected to the Melungeons, because this is how their lineages went on. And there were some famous Melungeons in history. And Brent Kennedy, he brought these things out, right? Okay, and one of them was Andrew Jackson, who was the president of the United States, was actually a Melungeon. Now, if it could be proven that his roots, that he had Muslim roots, think about this, making America great again, right? He had Muslim roots. He was the president of the United States. To show you what a lie it is to think that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are the basis of America. Also, Nancy Hanks, the wife of President Abraham Lincoln, his wife was Melungeon. Also, probably the most famous Melungeon was Elvis Presley. Look at Elvis's face. Put a gutra on his head. He looked like he came from Abu Dhabi. Look at him. Look at his face. This is a Melungeon look. You see? And so a lot actually happened in this time. Muslims were all over the place. So the relationship between even the government of the United States and Muslims, it was not negative like they try to portray it today. Even in the Revolutionary War, these are some of the names of people who fought in the Revolutionary War. Yusuf Ben Ali, he was known as Joseph Ben Haley, right? He fought with General Sumter in South Carolina. Bampit Muhammad, right? Revolutionary War, Virginia. Peter Salim, right? Or Salim. His slave name was Peter Buckminster. He fought in Massachusetts. He was honored with a U.S. postage stamp. Salim Poor fought in Massachusetts War. He became a hero. He was honored with a stamp as well. These people, you find on their graves stars and crescents. And you'll see it in their lineage. Francis Sabah, who was a sergeant with the Continental Troops. Okay, Joseph Sabah listed as a fifer in the Continental Troops as well. Now, this is an interesting point. When the 13 colonies wanted to be recognized by the world, the first country to recognize America was Morocco. And there was a treaty. And this is an actual picture of the treaty, Arabic and in English. It's a treaty between the Sultan of Morocco, Mohammed ibn Abdullah, and President George Washington. So the first country to recognize America was Muslim country. And look at the Sultan, right? He's not hiding his faith. Okay, so they were clearly Muslims. And there was actually some information to show that in the treaty, if any Moors were captured, and they use this term Moors, Americans thought it was like North Africans or somebody like, but if any Moors were actually, any Muslims were actually enslaved, they should be freed from slavery. It was within their treaties. And there are cases where you'll see the case of a number of famous African-American Muslims that when the government found out who they were, okay, and realized that they were Muslims, they freed them. And this is something that was within the treaty that was made between the United States and Morocco. So this is a presence that was all over the region, even in the United States, all over it, in the Caribbean region, down in Brazil, anywhere where you find people come with the Portuguese and the Spanish, Muslims were there amongst them. This is Islam in the far west, right? This is the presence of Islam in the far west. But because of the savagery of slavery and the Spanish domination, they tried to destroy all the records, but the records are coming back out to show the presence of Muslims. And these are some of the books. I'll just leave it here on the screen. If anybody wants to see an article, Kennedy, N. Brent Kennedy, The Melungeons, that's his book about this. There's one in Arabic that has some interesting information, Dr. Ali Kattani. Another interesting article by Dr. Umar Farouk Abdullah, Turks, Moors, and Morescos in early America. Okay, so you can get some of these texts, and you can read, you get more information concerning this topic. So I want to open up the floor for any questions that anybody may have about Islam in the far west after Columbus. So this is like during Columbus, and then it's after Columbus. It's Muslims in the far west. So the floor is open for any questions or comments that anybody may have. Question?
I once heard that 30 to 35% of the enslaved people that were brought to the Americas were probably Muslim. Have you heard any similar?
Yes, I mean, I have a book called Deeper Roots, which you can get online, and you'll see some of the things. I mean, I used the number 15 to 30%, because in some places it was less, some places it was more. But really, I mean, many people are saying, it's really 1 out of every 3. If you include Brazil and the Caribbean and all the region, 1 out of every 3 was a Muslim. But because of the pain of slavery and because of, what happened, the taking away of the names, and inshallah, in the coming session, we're going to look at this. I'm going to show you the actual documentation, where we get the proof of the presence of African Muslims, even scholars who were there amongst the enslaved people from Africa. Now, any other general questions anybody has? And, this is interesting because some people, if you can go back in your family, and I remember there was a friend of mine, Sheikh Nafi Muhammad Rahimahullah, I studied with him in Medina. And so he was from Philadelphia, but his family was from the Carolinas. And whenever his great-grandmother would get angry, and she's a person who was like right around slavery, right? So she would say, y'all ain't nothing but Aunt Haggard's illegitimate children. When she got angry. So you break that down, y'all ain't nothing. You all are nothing but Aunt Hajar. Remember Abraham, Sarah, and Hajar? In other words, Arabs, right? Whenever you act wild, she said, you ain't nothing but Aunt Hagar's illegitimate children. You're a bunch of Arabs. So even she was using these terminologies because many of the rebellious slaves were actually the Muslims. So whenever you see this, rebellious self, sometimes they use the word mandingo, especially in the Caribbean, mandingo, right? And that's the mandingo. The mandingo people and the Fulani people are the main Muslim groups who were leading the rebellions. And we're going to look at that, inshallah, next class, as we go along. Any other questions there? So this is an interesting look, and I've left you some of the sources there, and we'll be continuing on to look again at, we're now Islam in the far west. And this is eye-opening information for many people who have not seen it before. And our documents are growing and growing, and it's getting more and more interesting by the day. So I leave you with these thoughts, and I ask Allah to have mercy on me and you. Wa akhira da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.